It is a great honor to welcome to the show for the third time, Jonathan Kay of Quillette. Thank you very much, John, for joining the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How about you, man?
Can't complain.
Mhm. So, what's it like having surviving the Canadian winter and then heading to Canadian summer?
Oh, it, your attitude on weather in Canada is pretty much entirely dependent on your attitude towards sports. So if you're a skier or a snowboarder, you like it. If you're into hockey, maybe you like it because it's the hockey season, although that's mostly a spectator sport.
Mhm.
If you're not an athlete, there's really no reason to like winter in Canada.
Okay, well, I guess I have zero reason to like winter in Canada then. Yeah, I guess aside from the first 2 weeks of snow, then it'd be pretty good. But then everything gets dirty and mucky and muddy.
Yeah, I would say December, January, February, like I like snowboarding, so it's fun.
Mhm.
But then yeah, so now we're just coming out of the season. There's really no skiing, and uh it's not quite nice enough for a lot of summer sports. So yeah, April is a drag, November is a drag. The other months are pretty good. Again, it all depends on what your favorite sports are.
Mhm. Yes. I'm guessing you're living in Toronto right now, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What's it like living there?
Toronto's great. I mean, it sounds like you're no stranger to big cities. I think you lived in Hanoi and Vienna, where you are now, and I'm not sure where you were before that, but um, Toronto's great. It's a lot of people who come here um, admire just how much it's grown, and it's a very sophisticated place, but it's also in some ways just because of the way retail culture has become homogenous around the world. It can feel a little bit like you're in kind of just a big American city, although it's much safer, which is nice. That's
Okay.
that's the major benefit of living in this city.
Yeah,
It's expensive though. It's
that's
just
good to
like
hear.
it's become one of the most expensive cities in the world.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've had a chance to visit the city once or twice. Uh, I'll probably let you know when I'm there for the third time, maybe.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it's
Recording perfect.
yeah, the first and second day I was genuinely impressed, but then the third, my level of enjoyment or something just plummeted because uh, way too many tall buildings.
So we've had a huge building boom in the last, God, I want to say 20 years. I mean, part of it is just demand. So Canada is a country of about 40 million people that immigrates 400,000, something like that every year. So Canada immigrates 1% of its population every year. It's the equivalent of the United States accepting like 4 million immigrants every year. And as a result, there's most of those people end up in big cities and they need some place to live. So there's been huge price pressure on existing residences, and there's a
Mhm.
huge pressure to build more residences.
Mhm.
This is something young people especially talk about. Like, old people will, not all, I mean, conditions vary, but you've got old people who love the way their property values have increased, and young people who are upset. I think a typical apartment now is something like $3,000 Canadian a month. It's more than 2,000 US a month. Um, Houses are unaffordable for most people, so it's kind of becoming almost like New York or San Francisco in terms of prices.
Mhm. That's it. Well, I want to mention a bit your great interest in board games in addition to your journalistic works. So,
Yeah.
what is it about board games that appeal to you?
So lately, my passion for board games has been an outgrowth of my love of history. So, there are some historical subjects that are very complicated, and to understand them, it helps to really immerse yourself. So I'll just give one example, like the Russian Civil War that followed World War One.
Mhm.
It's sort of, I guess it extended from the end of World War One to the very early 1920s between the communists and the White Russians. but it was more complicated than that. There were all kinds of regional military theaters, and it overlapped with actually what was, in quantitative terms, an enormous Russian-Polish war, which almost resulted in the capture of Warsaw by the Russians. And I've read several books about the Russian Civil War. It's hard to kind of understand the military dynamics of it, just because geographically it's such an incredibly complicated conflict. Actually, maybe you can see in the background, there's a game called Triumph of Chaos, which is a game version of that conflict. And I've only played it twice, but just even the experience of playing it once, I think I played it once as the communist, on the communist side, and once on the White Russian side. And immediately you can then just appreciate some of the like logistical and military aspects of the war in a way that is very difficult if you're just reading a book.
Yes. I once played a version of Risk called set in World War II called Axis and Allies.
Yeah, very popular game. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Axis and Allies is a famous war game. There's others like Rise and Decline of the Third Reich is maybe a more complicated and less abstract. I mean, it's obviously any war game is going to be abstract, but yeah, I mean, I probably read dozens probably of books about World War II, but that historical knowledge has interplayed with historically inspired war games that seek to recreate or at least educate people about some of the historical aspects of these conflicts.
Yes, and I remember playing as the Axis powers, which went well until the Americans joined the Allied, which at the time I was in big trouble. So just like how history laid out.
Yeah, and they kind of present you with choices. Like the art of making a good game like that is they want to force you to make history go exactly the way it did. Like I actually never played Axis and Allies, but I played a lot of Rise and Decline of the Third Reich. And when you play the Allied player, and it's around, early 1944, you want to invade continental Europe to defeat the Germans. The game doesn't force you to attack northern France, like Normandy. However, it's very, you theoretically you could do a landing, I don't know, in Spain or even northern Germany, but it's difficult. So the art of design there is creating conditions that kind of maybe push things toward a historically accurate situation, but without actually like absolutely forcing the issue, and just making it feel like the game designers are making you do exactly what happened in history. But when you play games like that, I mean, some games are actually different. Some games actually intentionally maybe lead you into sort of an alternate universe version of history. But a lot of World War II games they kind of are guided by the historical forces that cause history to turn out in a certain way.
Right. So speaking of history, let me segue into our topic of the hour. You've written the introduction to a brand new series of articles titled "The Nations of Canada," which I'm very excited to read. Tell us about that.
So it's based on a podcast series by a Canadian historian named Greg Cable. Last name is spelled Koabel. He's a guy who was at University of Regina. He was in England for a while. He's now here back in Canada. He's an expert in Canadian history, but also in Stuart era English history and British history more generally, and has run for a long time a podcast called I think it's called History of Stuart England. But then he started this other podcast, coincided roughly chronologically because it's a lot of it is in the 17th century. So it's the Nations of Canada, and it's about the formation of the country we now call Canada. on the indigenous side, on the well, right now, the period we're about to get into with the Quillette adaptations is a huge protagonist is Samuel de Champlain and the French, but obviously the English become at least as important and eventually more important in that story. And yeah, we're adapting the podcasts to the written word, and we're very excited about it. We've published a couple of installments, plus my own introduction, and every 2 weeks we're publishing a new installment.
Mhm. Okay, so speaking of which, when I was studying in university in Canada, Trent, I believe, one of the colleges was named after Samuel Champlain, and at the time I was studying there were a lot of calls to change the name because something he has to do with indigenous subjugation and
Yeah.
everything. So what was the historical record on that?
I mean, Champlain is a super interesting character because when he came, like he was like a lot of early explorers. He was looking to make a buck, primarily with trade. He was very excited about, like at first, I guess in the late 16th century, it was all about fish, and then gradually, a lot of, including the French, realized that that the fur trade could be even more profitable. And to some extent, this is one reason Greg Cable is such a great historian. He talks about how developments in Russia, where a lot of furs had been coming from, were affected because there were all kinds of places you could get furs from. But if the Russian market wasn't serving up the furs, the North American market, as we now call it, became more attractive. And Champlain realized that in order to, his whole operation was based on getting European government monopolies on trading with the indigenous. He didn't, I think in the modern telling, it's imagined that Europeans just couldn't wait to colonize all the land, exterminate people, set up European style settlements and stuff. And to be fair, there were some fairly early on, there were people who wanted to do that. Champlain wanted to enrich himself through trade. And he had a great skill in establishing relationships with the Wendat people, the Huron, this is, I believe the French call them, the Algonquins, the Innu, and these relationships rose and fell according to how deep down the St. Lawrence Champlain was at any given time, and the Ottawa rivers and the Richelieu rivers. In those days, the rivers were the highways, and it's absolutely true that he became essentially the sharp tip of the spear in terms of the French colonial presence in North America. But like, for instance, he regarded the Jesuits who came to try and convert indigenous people largely as a nuisance. Like, he had no particular interest in telling the indigenous people how to live. He did set up, some fairly rudimentary settlements, but like, his first settlement in what's now Quebec City was a trading post. Like, again, it was all about trade and making money. And if you read history backwards as saying, well, anything that catalyzed colonialization is evil, then you're going to say that Champlain was evil because he was a leader in getting Europeans interested in and developing a foothold in North America. But if you judge historical figures according to their intentions, I think it's hard to paint Champlain as a real villain. Although, his historical record is mixed. I mean, he went to war with indigenous people, against indigenous people. His first big military venture, he and I believe it was the Algonquins, I think they sailed down the Richelieu River and fought a bunch of Iroquois. Everyone was very impressed because Champlain brought firearms and they'd never seen guns. But Champlain basically interjected himself within what was already a fairly complicated political situation involving various indigenous groups. Again, always with the goal of making a buck. And if you see that as being like, well, he's a monster of history, then he's a monster of history. But it's not how I see him. I see him as a much more complicated figure than that. Now, by the way, that said, often when people want to erase someone like Champlain, that to a certain extent, what they want to do is erase the simplistic, positive historical depiction of him. And to give you an example, I think it's in Aurelia. I was in Aurelia recently, and there's a statue of Champlain by the water. Again, I'm 90% sure it was Aurelia, but when I describe the statue, some people may know it. And it's a statue of Champlain, and there's all these like indigenous people sort of at his knees. There's like a real Christian aspect to it. Like it makes it look like he's this kind of semi-messianic figure who came over from Europe, and all these indigenous people just fell to their knees and were like kind of worshiping him. And there are, if that's what you're rebelling against, then I think you have a good case, because that's ridiculous. And indigenous people certainly did not fall to their knees and worship Champlain. They, to some extent, they had kind of, I don't know if contempt is the right word, but like they found the Europeans to be kind of ignorant and clumsy, and they had some cool weaponry and stuff like that, but they were like unathletic and short. And at one point, Champlain got lost in the wilderness for a couple of days when I think he was with the Algonquins, and he almost died because he didn't know how to survive in the wilderness. He was like you or me. If you, well, I don't want to make presumptions about you, but if I stumbled off into the Canadian Shield, 2 or 3 days, I'd probably be on death's door. So this was kind of the indigenous attitude toward people like Champlain.
Right. Another figure I would like to mention is, I believe, Egerton Ryerson.
Yeah.
Yeah, the university that's named after him, which is at your neck of the woods, changed its name to Toronto Metropolitan. That was like sometime before I left Canada. So yeah, tell us about like how Mr. Ryerson is being viewed today, and the decisions, like the reasons why the name had to be changed.
So yeah, so Ryerson University, it's a downtown Toronto university. This is one of these situations where, if you're familiar with Canadian history, you'll know that one infamous aspect of it is the residential school system, which is this school system that was set up. It was run by the churches, Protestant and Catholic priests and ministers ran it, but on behalf of the government, with an assimilative purpose to assimilate Indigenous people into Canada, into white industrial capitalist life. And after 1920, in some cases, not all cases, but in many cases, Indigenous families were compelled to send their children to these residential schools, which were boarding schools. They were forbidden to speak their languages. Some of the schools were extremely brutal. There was like corporal punishment, a lot of tuberculosis, several thousand at least Indigenous children died after being enrolled in these schools. This is all well documented. So when people talk about the residential school system, it's become and with some basis, a code word for like evil. Egerton Ryerson did not have anything directly to do with the residential school system. His advocacy work and policy work in regard to education in Canada, because that's what he was known for in part, predated the residential school system by several decades, if I remember correctly. However, there's this claim that says, well, okay, he didn't set up the residential school system, but he was influential in creating the intellectual climate that inspired other people to set up the residential school system. So on that basis, we're going to remove the name of Ryerson from this university that had been named after him decades ago. And so now it's settled on Toronto Metropolitan University, which is a hilariously bland name. So for instance, a couple weeks ago, there was this Twitter campaign by Ryerson, or as it's now known, TMU, where they said, hey, help us name our new sports mascot. And so like some of the suggestions were, how about
Bryson.
no? Well, that was one suggestion, but the other one was Toronto area mascot. That was hilarious.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that leads me closer to the subject of your article for Quillette recently is titled "A Public Servant Stood Up for Sex-Based Rights at a Gender Workshop and Paid the Price." And this regards to a woman who hold a I guess a DEI seminar, and then there's this guy who
Yeah. Oh,
asked
yeah.
questions, asked the wrong question, quote
Yeah.
unquote.
So this is one of these stories where it's one of these DEI seminars, probably goes on at tens of thousands of workplaces across North America every week. However, in this case, it was recorded, and when these things are recorded, people listen to it, and they can't believe it's shocking. By the way, not all DEI seminars are like this. Like this, it's possible to do DEI in a completely intelligent and humane way. Um, you know, I know people who their DEI is like a guy comes in and says, "Hey, look, don't scream at people in meetings, don't tell racist jokes, don't like hit on your coworkers, be respectful, uh, you know, try and make your workplace accessible to disabled people." Like it's just common sense stuff. It's not like some of this ideological stuff where someone comes in and says, we live in a society soaked in white supremacism. If you're a white person, hang your head and uh, you know, beg for penitence. Like it's it's um or beg for absolution, I should say. It's not like that in some places, but this a lot of public institutions in Canada, and this was the BC office of the ombudsperson. Um, they tend to bring in like these very crazy people because the people who are on the DEI committee often, because it's a self-selected group of people who are extremely excited about DEI stuff, they go out and they find the craziest person they can to give DEI seminars. So in this case, it was a seminar on um, accommodating and welcoming people who are transgender or gender diverse or whatnot, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. If a person has gender dysphoria, there are ways to make that person feel more welcome in the workplace. Or if they're one of your clients, or you're serving them through, in this case, it was the BC Office of the Ombudsperson, some of the people who are going to be calling the BC Office of the Ombudsperson to complain about government services, some of them are going to be transgender. What's the best way to deal with people like that? So it's not like it's an inappropriate subject, but the person who they brought in to teach the seminar was a well-known local extremist. Give an example of how extreme this person, their name is Adrian Smith, campaigned against a rape crisis center in Vancouver. Like, who campaigns against a rape crisis center? But this person campaigned against a rape crisis center because the rape crisis center would not let biologically male, trans-identified volunteers come in and act as rape crisis counselors to women who had been raped. On the completely, like, obviously you don't want biological men coming in and their job is to be trauma counselors to women who've been raped, and this biological sex matters in that kind of context. And this person, Adrian Smith, was furious and successfully lobbied for government funding to be dropped from the Rape Crisis Center on this basis. This person, same person, Adrian Smith, was brought in to give this like wacky, completely over-the-top training on trans issues to the staff, I guess about 100 people at the Office of the Ombudsperson in BC in 2021. I got the whole recording of it, and it's just as crazy as you would assume, including a recording of this person who asked a completely reasonable question. This person was identified simply as Nick in the audio, and you can hear, if people, I embedded audio in the article. Nick asked a question saying, "Hey," and Nick's very polite, "Love listening to what you have to say. I can really see myself applying it in my day-to-day work. However, don't you think that, in some contexts, people have legitimate," I'm paraphrasing here, "people have legitimate concerns about biological sex differences, even in the case of trans-identified individuals?" And Adrian Smith just viciously went after him. Compared Nick to the kind. I'm paraphrasing here, although very close to the original words. Comparing him to one of those, I believe she said, white women who complain about Black women coming into bathrooms because they think all Black women have syphilis. That was the odious comparison that Adrian Smith made in regard to Nick's question. And the whole thing was eventually investigated because Adrian Smith is a lawyer, it came up for investigation by the BC Law Society, and there was a paper trail on that, which I got a hold of that too. But again, these things, yes, it's shocking. Yes, what happened to Nick is bad. Nick eventually, and what was worse is that Nick's own boss obviously took Adrian Smith's side because he wanted to be like affirming of trans people or whatever. And so Nick was subject to further discipline. He had to take sensitivity training. And eventually, anyway, things got too hot for Nick, and he left the employment of this, the office of the ombudsperson. But again, these stories, yeah, it's shocking in its own right, but it's important to tell these stories because this is happening all over. I can tell you it's happening all over the public service in Canada. Maybe not as much private corporations, because private corporations are very mindful of, especially you have the labor shortage these days in some industries, so they don't want to go too hard on this crap because people will just quit. But if people who have very cushy public service jobs with wonderful perks and 6 weeks vacation and mental health leave and all, pension maybe on the way, they don't want to rock the boat, so they're happy. Well, I mean, not happy, but they're willing to subject themselves to this brainwashing just to keep their job. And so it's in the public service that you get some of the most excruciating examples of this kind of propaganda.
I got to introduce myself to the works of the philosopher Charles Taylor from your country, obviously.
Yeah.
He had an essay called "The Politics of Recognition," which he believes that if even a neutral liberal society is severely lacking at its recognition of diverse groups. And I think about the essay when I think about the growing intensity in the trans debate, so to speak. And I think from the perspective, this is hypothetical, of a trans person, I would say that, well, they often hear they're not discriminated, but they're definitely not recognized. On one camp, you have the J.K. Rowling women who says explicitly that they are not what they think. You're not what you think you are. Like for example, you're a woman, but you're male to female transgender. But then these women do not accept you as one of them. And on the other, you have the right, which says that you are not allowed in, say, women's sports and women's prisons and Bud Light commercials and whatnot. And that is when you feel both excluded and not recognized. And I think for Taylor would say that in order for this new population seeking recognition, i.e. the trans population, some sort of conciliatory measures has to be given to them, or else they would be radicalized. And that's why you see all of these entirely radical measures being adopted by, I guess, the trans lobby, so to speak.
Well, if recognition is what's at issue, I think recognition has been provided 10 times over. There's all these websites that track, here, I can look at it now, all the transgender days on the calendar. So there's Transgender Day of Remembrance, that's November 20th. There's Trans Day of Visibility, that's March 31. There's Transparent Day. There's International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. International Day of Pink. National Coming Out Day, which I guess that's mostly sexual orientation, but Non-Binary Awareness Week, Non-Binary People's Day, There's Pronouns Day, the third Wednesday in October. Trans Awareness Month. Like, if you're talking about recognition, we're talking about a population that's less than 1% of the total population. It's taught in schools now. There's all these days, which is fine. I mean, some people have gender dysphoria. It's absolutely legit to say, hey, there's some people who are biologically male and they want to live life as a woman. So let's, be respectful of that and don't make fun of them. When I was a kid, it was common to like make fun of them. They were called transvestites or whatever. Like, people were very cruel, and I'm glad we don't do that anymore. It's not polite and it's not humane. So to the extent recognition is important, I mean, that ship sailed a long time ago. There's tons of recognition. I am jazz, and there's tons of, there's RuPaul, and I mean, drag is obviously different, but in the last year or two, actually, they've sort of merged a little bit in terms of the political activism. So if this were 20 years ago and someone were making the argument like Charles Taylor is kind of, I mean, he's been famous for decades, and I'm familiar with some of his theories, but more in regard to multiculturalism back in the 90s. But if this were 20 or 30 years ago and people are saying, yeah, we need more recognition for transgender people, you could make an argument on that basis, but I don't think you can make that argument now. It's, you can't go a few weeks on the calendar without the local public schools celebrating some trans day or trans book month or trans this or trans that. Like, there's a lot of it. So, and again, I'm not necessarily objecting to all of it. I think it's good that children who suffer gender dysphoria, people are educated about how to deal with that, but there is certainly no lacking recognition on this issue.
Okay, I see. So one of the parts in the article, you mentioned that in the Adrian Smith presentation, a screen grab of the show Mr. Bean was being included, which I watched that show a lot as a kid, and I always got a kick out of it. So how does Mr. Bean place in a DI Maoist struggle session here?
Yeah, I mean, that was a good attention getter because there's basically one story or one slide. So this was a totally separate mini scandal at the office of the BC Ombudsperson, again, which is this entity, this public entity in British Columbia, where they brought in these DEI people, and these ones were they were talking about decolonization. And talking about how racist Canada is, and one of their talking points, and again, I get a lot of leaks, so I got all the slides, and fortunately this happens so much in Canada, people now kind of I've become sort of the go-to guy for saying a lot of this stuff, and they were talking about like how white supremacist and racist Canada is, and how we're worse than the Nazis and stuff. And they put up a slide indicating that the Holocaust was apparently inspired by Canada. And in the slide, they had a picture of, it's sort of a famous screenshot of Mr. Bean. It's some sketch from Mr. Bean from the 90s in which he's like doing a test and he's trying to copy his answers off the guy next to him. And so they took this still shot from Mr. Bean, and like they labeled Mr. Bean as the Nazis or Hitler or whatever, or the Holocaust, whatever it was. And then the guy who's being copied from was Canada. So the idea was like this really crude, tasteless, completely bizarre, not to mention historically inaccurate, way of suggesting that 6 million people died because Canada had the wrong kind of constitution. It was just, and that this was, I think Canadian elites have they give a lot of latitude towards some of this DEI stuff because they don't want to be seen as off message on it. However, this was so bizarre that at least one, and I think two national Jewish groups, their BC office actually took the issue up with the BC government. And people in the BC government in turn took the BC ombudsperson office to task over it. Because, like, yes, you can get away with a lot in the sphere, teach all kinds of nonsense, but using Mr. Bean as a sight gag to refer to the Holocaust is seen as, even for 2023, where you can get away with pretty much anything, putting any crap into these DEI presentations you want, as long as you're trying to argue that Canada's a white supremacist hellhole. Even that was seen as too much. By the way, I should say that it's I only have about 5 or 10 minutes left because I have to go pick up my daughter.
Okay. I think we'll just end on the Nick Smith exchange that you mentioned. So Smith says this is not a question about a disagreement of terms or something that can be politely debated. This is a dispute between people who are seeking justice and those who would prefer that we were dead. And I think the hyperbolic language is a telltale sign of totalitarianism, really, and I'm certainly convinced that wokeism is totalitarian in its politics and its approach. So how do you explain this, like this inadmissibility of debate that people like Smith invokes?
So I don't like to use words like totalitarian because, to me, totalitarian has a certain historical context. It evokes the kind of government that sets up gulags, people thrown in jail and stuff like that. And I'm always worried because when people talk about cancel culture and political correctness and stuff, yeah, I find it annoying and I don't like it, and I've devoted a good part of my career to fighting it. But I also recognize that if we lived in a totalitarian society, somebody like me would be in jail because I make fun of this stuff all the time. If this were 1930s Stalinist Russia and I was here, running the 1930s version of a Twitter account, making fun of this nonsense, like, I would have been dead a long time ago. So, and I realize you're not suggesting that the word totalitarian in this context means gulags and stuff. But I do see what you mean. I call it's the totalitarian impulse. And the totalitarian impulse is widely shared among all human beings. Basically, what happens is if a particular sect or ideological strain of belief or political party feels that they have a dominant position in the culture war or in the political war or in the real war, whatever conflict is at issue, if they feel they have a dominant position, they want to lock that advantage in. They don't want to keep it up for grabs. So if you look around a university and say, wow, like 60% of the people at this university agree with trigger warnings, and they agree that, like, trans women are women, full stop, and that J.K. Rowling is horrible, and that Ibram X. Kendi is fantastic, and white people are, guilty of genocide, like all this stuff. There's just this natural human impulse that say, well, if we have the numbers, let's create policies that lock this in, that make it a hate crime to speak on behalf of the other 40%, that make it a hate crime to say, well, trans women, in some contexts, they're not really women, like prisons and maybe sports and stuff. I'll say, well, we'll call that a hate crime. And, opposing affirmative action, that makes, that means you're, that's a hate crime. And in some campuses, articulating pro-life beliefs in the abortion debate, or I should say anti-abortion beliefs in the abortion debate, that's somehow a crime against feminism. I happen to be pro-choice, but I think it's ridiculous when we pretend that person who's anti-abortion is a hate criminal. And so what we call the totalitarian reflex, I think, is a human reflex, which says, my side is winning in this little sphere. Doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily in the society at large, but in my little treehouse, my side is winning. So I'm going to change the rules of debate so that, because I've got 60% of the people here, so I'm going to get them. I have a supermajority, and we're going to lock this in. And that way, 10, 20, 50 years can pass. No one's going to be able to upend our view of life because we've created rules that make it illegal to do so. And to be fair, I think conservatives do this too. And if you look around the world, you have places like Poland and Turkey and Russia, where essentially you have nationalists who are saying it's now against the law to say certain things that denigrate our country historically. So in Poland, you can't say certain things about Polish participation in the Holocaust. In Turkey, you can't say certain things about the Kurds, or about a lot of things, actually. In Russia, you can't say anything that denigrates, even indirectly, the Russian war effort in Ukraine. You can't even call it a war effort. They call it like a special security operation or some bullshit. So nationalists, conservatives, reactionaries do this all the time. In fact, historically, they're the ones who are mostly guilty of it. We were talking about Stuart England before. In Stuart England, if you started talking about like the wonders of Catholic popery, like you could end up in jail, like because most people in the country were Protestant, or some species of Protestant, Calvinist or Arminian or whatever, and they had a lock on public debate. And what we're seeing now is just one species of that. And so, yes, it's a totalitarian impulse, but I try and remind people totalitarians are first and foremost human beings, and there's a totalitarian impulse within all of us. And it's important to remember, because 5 years from now, the culture war may be different, and it'll be my side or your side. I don't know that we're on the same side, but that is ascendant. And we have to resist the impulse to tell everybody, well, that you have to talk like us. You're not allowed to say trans women are women. Like, I want to live in a world where it's fine for J.K. Rowling or others to be skeptical of these slogans, but I also want to live in a world where it's fine to say these slogans and debate them. That's kind of where I want to be.
I see. Well, for me, I prefer to keep my views on things like ambiguous and nuanced, so nobody can claim me on any side. It's like that Groucho Marx Woody Allen quote, right? I would rather not be in a club that accepts me as a member.
I would never join a club that would have me as a member. Yeah,
Yes.
That's a great quote.
Yes, and on that note, thank you very much, John Kay, for joining the show for yet another time.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, take care, man. And
all right,
until next time.
Okay, take care. Bye.